Okay, we good? I think we're good. Yeah, welcome. Thank you so much. I recognize a lot of friendly faces and some new faces, so we really appreciate you attending our program. We do these monthly, and we sometimes do them more than monthly, which would be bi-monthly? That works, right? Yeah, So this tonight we have Dr. David Morton, UCF professor, and his wonderful book, Motion Picture Paradise. It's the history of filmmaking in Florida. Because we were like, as y'all have probably surmised, silent movie paradise in Jacksonville, Florida mostly. Yeah?
Indeed.
Yeah. So we, coincidentally today, I wanted to show the two youngsters that I work with, Will and Kate, a scene from a 1939 black and white movie in which Joan Crawford and Norma Shearer had an encounter in a dressing room because Joan Crawford is stealing Norma Shearer's husband. Norma finds out and she goes in the other dressing room and they have this repartee, but it's so mannered. And you realize they were silent actresses. So that led us to talking about Florida, silence, and coincidentally you're coming tonight. So.
Synchronicity right there.
Synchronicity, exactly. So, plus I always like to mention Norma Shearer as many times as I can. He's the best. So without further ado, again, welcome, and David Morton. Pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you again, Jim, for setting this up, and thank you all for coming out tonight. This book is a real labor of love on my part. I have spent the better part of about 10 years diving into different areas of just very vastly, I think, underrated and unknown part of film history. A little bit about myself, first and foremost. I first came down to Florida in 2010. I'm not from Florida originally. I grew up in Long Island, went to college in Pennsylvania. One of my best friends in college became a personal assistant to Burt Reynolds when he was running his museum and film and acting school down in Jupiter. And this is back in the day where I was still hoping to break into the movie industry myself. So I had a bunch of half-baked ideas for TV pilots, some very bad screenplays, and long story short, I show up in South Florida right in the middle of the heyday of its TV boom. You have shows like Dexter, Burn Notice, and The Glades going on. It was such an exciting environment to be in, and my friend was jumping from audition to audition in the meantime while I was trying to write these half-baked screenplays. Needless to say, I had a chance to work for a short while with Burt Reynolds in his Jupiter Museum, which was a revelatory experience for myself. And, well, very soon after that, I watched as the industry down in South Florida started to fall off. I ended up making a different career path choice. I decided instead of writing films, I was more interested in studying them. So I eventually pursued a PhD in film history at UCF. So now that's what I do. I teach film, I study it, I analyze it, and one question I kept coming back to is what exactly went wrong in the 2010s in Florida that now has it where Florida is one of only 10 states in the U.S. to not have a dedicated film office. And it's become essentially a punchline in the industry where if you have a show or television series or film that's about Florida, a lot of times it ends up being filmed somewhere else. And well, this is where I dived into a really incredible subject that has a very deep and nuanced story and a lot of ebbs and flows. In fact, what I basically have worked out is that we could break down the entire history of Florida's film industry into 5 acts, starting with filmmakers who came down during the silent era, and at least for a very brief while, North Florida, and specifically Jacksonville, outproduced Southern California at least 3-1 in the number of films that were being made. 1917, at the height of film production in Jacksonville, there are more movies coming out of Jacksonville than there are coming out of Hollywood. And then very quickly, Florida gets in its own way, and things deteriorate. Even after Hollywood becomes, the monolith that it became, it doesn't mean that it wrote Florida off entirely either. Over the course of the next 20 to 30 years, a number of fascinating second location films were shot, mostly in and around Ocala National Forest and in north central Florida. Then, this is where we have the grindhouse movies, B-movies, drive-ins from the 50s and 60s. We have some really fun, campy movies we're going to take a look at there. And then finally, well, by the time we get to the late 70s and early 1980s, there's a concerted effort through first Governor Reuben Askew, but then followed through by Governor Bob Graham to bring the film industry to Florida. So much so that by the 1980s, Florida is the third most sought after location for film production outside of New York and California. And then, well, once again, things deteriorate. So we can look at the ups and downs of the industry and maybe a more positive outlook to its future. So these first clips are silent. I'll just talk right through them. What you're looking at here are two of the oldest known recorded images of the state of Florida. In 1898, Florida is the fourth or fifth least populated state in the U.S. It still very much is a frontier on the absolute periphery of the United States, and a place that has, a great sense of distance. In February of 1898, the USS Maine sinks in Havana Harbor, and William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate who later gets satirized by Orson Welles in Citizen Kane, was attempting to drive up wartime fervor and to get the public in favor of basically declaring war on Spain. So Hearst, aside from the newspapers, was also beginning to dabble in the motion pictures. And he teams up with Thomas Edison, and they send several cameramen down to first record the funeral to the victims of the USS Maine and their burial in Key West. So this funeral procession you're seeing right here is the oldest known recordings of Key West. And then he also kept some cameramen around in Key West to document the moment the United States declared war on Spain. Several more Hearst-affiliated cameramen arrive in Tampa soon after to watch Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders embark for Cuba and for their great adventure. And this is really the first time the public encounters Florida on the screen. Periodically, between 1898 to about 1908, we have a few different productions that end up coming through Florida, mostly along the Henry Flagler and Henry Plant Railway, mostly staying in posh resort hotels like the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine. And usually these films were travelogues. Their end goal was not Florida, but usually the Caribbean. So they would shoot a couple small scenes, either at like the Ponce de Leon Hotel or the Tampa Bay Hotel, and then just keep on moving along. But really the first major breakthrough for the film industry in Florida comes in December of 1908. And there are three major events in film history that all coincide into a perfect storm. One, this is considered to be one of the coldest winters on record. And one of the biggest challenges for early film production was that the cameras would jam up if the cameras basically got too cold. The next major thing is that in New York, the mayor of New York had issued a citywide Nickelodeon ban, shutting down every single movie theater and also then shutting down productions across the entire city. And then third, well, Thomas Edison, who had been bent on collecting as many patent claims as possible, ends up pulling together 9 motion picture companies together under one single umbrella called the Motion Picture Patent Company. One of the companies he acquires is the Kalem Company. And with this, all of a sudden, Edison and Edison-affiliated studios have become the uncontested master of the film industry. And unlike many of the other studios that Edison acquired, Kalem was doing something very novel and different. Most of the films that you would see around 1908 were usually very stodgy and mostly adaptations of Broadway plays. Kalem takes their camera outside. And they don't just take their camera anywhere. They quite literally travel the world. They'll film in Egypt, Palestine, Ireland, and they'll use location filmmaking as a way to bring audiences in. And they also come up with very interesting and ambitious, if you will, scenarios that use history, that use landscape and the environment that they're in. Sidney Olcott was the main go-to director for the Kalem Company, and his muse and collaborator was a woman by the name of Jean Gontier. And Gontier was also known as the Kalem Girl. So back then, this is how you would associate your companies, is who was basically the headliner for the company. And Gontier has a pretty straightforward summary of what her experience that first winter in 1908, 1909 was like in Jacksonville. For the moving picture industry, this venture was almost epic-making, establishing as it did new artistic standards, particularly in atmosphere, and inaugurating the custom of traveling far and wide in search of effective and authentic backgrounds. Again, we take this for granted today for productions, that you'll go to any corner of the earth to get a good shot. Kalem is one of the first companies to truly begin to experiment with this. And she also emphasizes that the kind of community that they're able to build in Jacksonville presents a very stark and interesting contrast to what eventually ends up getting created in Hollywood. Probably the most popular of the Kalem series were a series of Civil War films that Gontier actually wrote the script for and ends up starring in, called the Girl Spies series. In this series, she played a real-life Confederate spy by the name of Belle Boyd, who would disguise herself as a Union soldier and then sneak behind enemy lines and infiltrate, basically, the Union. So what you're seeing here really is nothing spectacular, I think, by our standards, but this is revolutionary for audiences of the 1900s and 1910s. The idea of having the camera outside, using the sunlight that the Florida offers at least sometimes of the year. And then finally, in addition to that too, just having action scenes that are, utilizing this landscape and environment. And what I've researched and argue is that before you had the Western, you had the Southern. So the same kind of archetypes and standards that we later see with Western genre films, they're being worked on here with Gontier and the Girl Spy series. So that's just a little snapshot right there. Other filmmakers who are coming to Florida during the silent era are just as bold and ambitious as the Kalem Company. Captain Jack Bonavita is one of my favorites. He was a one-armed lion tamer who lost his arm taming lions. And he started doing a series of jungle pictures where they actually end up setting loose menageries of animals in the woods outside of Tampa. Some don't get fully recovered. We'll talk about at least one group of macaques that continue to cause problems in Silver Springs in a short while. So Tampa is beginning to emerge. Jacksonville is beginning to emerge as a very actively sought-after film center. Well, what goes wrong? And I think that's where we can begin to take a look a little bit more closely into what Florida and maybe the motion picture industry itself lost as a result.
So why is it empty today?
Okay, this is almost it. Imagine this happening in your city. Right now, I'm at Monroe and Davis in Jacksonville, where a mob of more than 1,000 extras almost completely destroyed a saloon in the movie The Clarion. Like, totally destroyed it. Okay, do I look like that guy?
This happened more than once. Here's a crowd chasing a baby carriage down the street in downtown Jacksonville. It held a very large baby. By the mid-1910s, Jacksonville residents were starting to get sick of movies overrunning their town. Jacksonville had extended a genuine welcome to film, like Vim Comedy and Eagle Film. The mayor was a film booster who thought film would bring a new era to Jacksonville. He had the support of every production company in Jacksonville, and the city was set to be a hub. He was up for election in 1917, a year after that big riot during the shooting of The Clarion. Businessmen were behind the mayor, and he asked the people of Jacksonville to vote for him and support the motion picture film companies he brought in. He lost. It was a vote against corruption, but also against the movies running wild through Jacksonville. During this time, Hollywood had grown a lot, despite being further away from New York. Mismanagement of companies in Jacksonville, World War I, and an influenza outbreak didn't help the Florida city. There was a lot of bad luck. After the 1917 election, a lot of studios closed up shop in Florida. The city had, in effect, voted against a future in movies. In the meantime, hit movies, like those made by legendary director D.W. Griffith, had made Hollywood a home for film. Hollywood was ready to be a movie town. Jacksonville couldn't make the jump. Jacksonville shows us an alternate universe for movies. One where different comedy teams became legendary, where the duo of Laurel and Hardy was Plump and Run instead. And there are other reasons too, beyond movie stars. That sign up top should say Norman Laboratories. After Eagle Studios closed, a producer named Richard Norman bought it. While Hollywood made movies featuring actors in blackface, Norman Studios made films like The Flying Ace, starring heroic black characters played by black actors. It was one of a few film studios that focused on black audiences and black characters, and it sat outside the Hollywood system. It wasn't the mainstream. If things had gone a little differently in Jacksonville, our culture could have been shaped by an entirely different set of stories. But instead, all we have are a few restored films, and some buildings that are waiting for the same.
Well, that's a whole nother talk right there on Norman Studios, but the effort more recently by the operators at Richard Norman Studios has been really astounding in its own right. They have just acquired all the remaining buildings of that film facility, and they've created a dedicated film history museum to the work that Richard Norman had done. Now, what you just saw there is only one small part of the story. There are a bunch of other factors that doomed Jacksonville. One came with a Supreme Court case in 1915 that broke up the Edison monopoly. So in the 1910s, you had these so-called independent filmmakers, men like Carl Laemmle, Adolf Zukor, William Fox. They created small studios such as Paramount Studios, Fox, and Paramount. And their studios are the ones that went out west, while the Edison-affiliated studios were the ones that went south to Jacksonville. So once the Supreme Court rules against Edison and his monopoly, that already is a poison pill against the Edison-affiliated studios. The other thing that happens too is in 1916, there's a very controversial governor's race. We have a very interesting character appear in Florida politics in 1916, a one-eyed Baptist minister, originally from Alabama, who had only lived in the state for a couple years, who runs on the Prohibition Party ticket. Sidney J. Katz was also nicknamed the Cracker Messiah, and he had a very novel way of campaigning where all the other governor candidates did whistle-stop tours along the Plant and Flagler Railway. He got in a car and went into swamp towns and villages that had never seen a legislator, let alone a governor's candidate, and he manages to convince them to vote for him. As a prohibitionist, he of course hated alcohol and fun. We wouldn't be allowed to have our wine here tonight. But also prohibitionists despised the movies as well. They believed that saloons and the movies basically went in tandem with one another as spaces of ungodly vice. And with him in power, all of a sudden he starts to get a number of imitators, including this very sober-looking lawyer right here by the name of John W. Morton, who also later goes on to become governor of Florida. And Morton was the man who ran against the pro-movie mayor, John Edward Theodore, but he liked to go by this instead, just easy times, boys, Bowden. And Bowden had been mayor of Jacksonville before. He was the mayor that oversaw the rebuilding and reconstruction of Jacksonville after the Great Fire of 1901. And in 1915, 1917, he really had a vision of building his city into a preeminent New South city, kind of in the vein of what Atlanta would eventually become. And he saw the film industry as the way to make it happen. In the end, by losing this race, we sort of see a very different pivot and turn in the direction of Florida politics and also the industry itself. But yet the movie industry doesn't completely collapse. As you saw mentioned in the other clip, in the early 1920s, an itinerant filmmaker by the name of Richard Norman, who was a white director, I think that's worth pointing out as well, had been doing a series of movies that he had shot out in the Midwest. And he had a really novel approach to doing his movies. He would shoot an entire feature film, and then he would show up in a town and ask the mayor or like a local business owner if they wanted a cameo in his movie. He would then pretend that he's doing a whole feature production that he's already shot, shoot maybe 2 scenes, cut it into the movie, do a whole big premiere, make fortune, and then immediately after that move on to the next town and recut it. In 1922, he does a remade version of a film called The Green-Eyed Monster. He retitles it The Wrecker, and this time he reshoots the entire film with an all-black cast. And he makes more money with that film than he had with any of his other films in his career. And of course, then he buys out the Eagle Studio lot at bottom dollar prices, and we have in Jacksonville then the only film studio dedicated to what we call race films in the entire United States. And here's just a short overview of the significance and the meaning of Richard Norman Studios.
Richard E. Norman was a pioneering race filmmaker. Interestingly enough, he was a white man who was making race films. Race films are films that were intended primarily for Black viewers, Black audiences, and they used Black actors and Black themes and were shown primarily in race theaters. It's just beginning to come to the forefront, even among people who are cinema scholars. There's a very limited amount of material that has survived, and that's primarily because race filmmakers were not particularly well funded. They worked largely independently, not under the auspices of a particular studio. In order to know where we are today, we have to know where we were 100 years ago. So I think these are extremely important, not simply interesting films in themselves because they're fictional films, but they're also very interesting documents in terms of Jim Crow society and the socio-historic context of that particular time.
Now, the tragedy of Norman Studios was that it wasn't necessarily Florida politics that ended his run as a studio producer. It was the transition to sound. Specifically, he had anticipated that sound technology was going to take over, and he put all his money down on the wrong bit of technology, where the Warner Vitaphone became the standard that all projectors would eventually use. He invested in something called the camera phone. And 6 projectors ended up using it, and well, with that, he also then lost his life savings and his studio. That said, Jacksonville isn't the only place where films are being made during this time. D.W. Griffith, the man sometimes credited with creating the first feature film and establishing Hollywood as the center of the American film industry, by the 1920s is on the outs with Southern California. He builds a studio in Queens, in New York, and he is still interested in using tropical settings and exotic settings for some of his films that you're not going to get in New York. So 2 films that he tries to do in 1922, The Love Flower and Idle Dancer, are filmed just outside of Fort Lauderdale, and both productions could not have gone worse. In The Idle Dancer, his lead actress, Clarine Seymour, tries to do a stunt where she jumps from one coconut tree to the next and she falls out of the tree and crushes her intestines. She lives long enough to finish the film and then dies 3 weeks after shooting finishes. And she becomes one of the first major celebrity deaths in Hollywood history. He still comes back to Fort Lauderdale, and he tries to shoot another movie called The Love Flower, and while doing location scouting, he gets shipwrecked along with his cameraman Billy Bitzer and his crew, and it takes 3 days for the U.S. Coast Guard to actually recover Griffith and the crew after being stranded on a desert island. He doesn't come back after that. I wonder why. But the next big breakthrough comes during the Great Depression. And with the collapse of the Florida land boom in 1927-28, Florida is already experiencing the Depression roughly about a year and a half before the rest of the country. A new governor is elected in 1928, Doyle Carleton, a real estate developer from Tampa. And Carleton sees an opportunity to try to convince the movie studios to build up studios on Tampa's west coast. So possibly even turning Tampa into a third coast for the American film industry. And he hires a real estate developer named Trenton Collins to create a committee for the development of the motion picture. He gets involved in a letter writing campaign to directors, producers, and people out in Hollywood who might be interested in coming to Tampa. His first big bite is a director named Henry King, who brings his actress Lupe Velez to Tampa to film Hell Harbor. And if you have not heard of Hell Harbor, that might be a reason why. It's not really the greatest movie. It gets panned even when it comes out. But one thing that was very popular, especially among people in Tampa and to the governor, was the $1 million+ that the production spent during their time of filming. And this is really where the governor starts going all in on trying to build more film studios. Collins continues writing letters, and he gets a few more high-profile bites. Buster Keaton, who had a really hard time with the transition to sound, had a disastrous deal with MGM Studios, and he manages to finally break his contract with MGM, and he goes independent, and he creates a new film company called Flamingo Pictures, and his whole plan was to build a film studio in St. Petersburg and basically operate it as the new second Hollywood. The problem was that Keaton was going through a lot, both emotionally and personally at that time. At least from what I've read in some of the accounts, it was said that all he did was his work. He did most of his work in a local bar, where from time to time he entertained customers by taking off his pants and sweeping the floor with them. They also end up getting in touch with a Paramount producer who had a lot of credentials, had a lot of bravado, and I've seen it in the letters I've read. But then I also found some letters of warning about this person. His name was Aubrey Kennedy, and he was considered to be one of the best producers in the business when sober. Wasn't very sober by 1932-33. Prohibition's winding down, and Florida, this is rum-running country. So a little bit too much temptation. Needless to say, Keaton never shoots a frame of his promised picture, The Fisherman, I think it was called. And Kennedy, for that matter, manages to raise roughly about $3 million from local Tampans to create 3 movies shot on this backlot that he had built simultaneously. One film ends up getting destroyed when the film rushes were flown to New York. The plane crashes on its way to New York, and the film rush is incinerated. The other remaining ones do come out, but as Fred Wright of the St. Pete's Independent later recalled, all that was left of the studio were ghostly rhetorics and melodramatics of movie actors and cameramen who had the dubious honor of making 3 of the worst movies in cinema history. I used to have clips of those movies, but now they've been taken down, and maybe we'll just consider ourselves lucky that we don't have to look at how bad they were. But that said, this is not the only place where movies are coming to Florida. In the late 1930s, we also are seeing the Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan films being shot outside of Silver Springs in Ocala. And in fact, there's a local legend that I played a role in helping to debunk, and that is that the monkeys that were featured in the Tarzan movies were set loose and have terrorized the Silver Springs since then. Now, there is certainly a lot of macaques that are causing attacks out there, but I think the blame had been misdirected. And here's just like a short news story I helped to contribute on.
During an afternoon boat cruise in Ocala, people found themselves in the middle of this. Dozens of monkeys go flying from a tree straight into the river.
Just sounded like war going on back there. I mean, just crazy hooting and hollering and screeching and branches, and it was just the craziest thing I've ever heard.
What you don't see before Matt Schwanke started recording is what he describes as a turf war between 2 bands of the Silver Springs macaques.
One jumped off, and then the male started shaking branches, going up there and shaking branches, trying to shake them off the tree. And then I started recording, and it was the craziest thing.
Folklore suggests the macaques were left in the area after the filming of Tarzan Finds a Son in 1939. But according to University of Florida researchers, the primates were brought in years earlier by a local boat tour company as an attraction. While this is a rare sight, a few years ago, a kayaker took this video showing the monkeys jumping into the river just feet away from him. A lot of people go searching for the monkeys, but Schwanke has a warning for anyone planning to get close.
Don't show your teeth. That'll irritate them if they're just doing their own thing and you start making monkey noises and showing your teeth. Obviously, that's going to irritate them. Especially if one of the dominant males see you doing that, they're going to throw something at you.
Connor Hansen, Fox 35 News.
The fact that he even had to say that, right? Oh my gosh. So this is just another example of the movies getting a bad rap and getting blamed for problems that they necessarily didn't cause. Just like when we saw with Jacksonville, that so-called riot that happened in 1916, you could tell it was very carefully controlled, but yet that's just what happens. But this is really where the center of gravity begins to shift from Jacksonville and Tampa and South Florida to Ocala National Forest. A swim coach from Ocala High School named Newton Perry, who later founded Weeki Wachee Springs, is going to be one of the key unsung heroes of this next stage of Florida film history. He was a location scout for Tarzan Finds a Son. He got in really good with a number of MGM producers, and he became close friends with Johnny Weissmuller. Even before that, he helped to also begin to pioneer a new frontier of film development with underwater film photography. And in fact, he was responsible for inventing an air hose that allowed stunt performers to stay underwater for sustained periods of time. So we see that even today with the Weeki Wachee mermaids. That all goes back to Newton Perry. And here's a British Pathé newsreel from 1940 that just shows you some of the remarkable stunts and work that they were doing during this time.
Gliding smoothly along the tree-barred reaches of Silver Springs, Florida, you come face to face with one of nature's miracles. The water is limpid and crystal clear. It's a perfect setting for submarine photography. But if you must take underwater pictures, you can't be over careful. The main essentials, of course, are a watertight camera with special lenses. Thus equipped, you can wander about at your leisure, looking for subjects for your album. Our cameraman was exceptionally lucky. He happened to be strolling along the bottom when members of a touring underwater show were rehearsing some of the tricky bits. And did he dry up? Yes, he just didn't. The stroke the girls use is a kind of crawl, but it's one of fate's kindest strokes for our picture hound. The first step in the training of the underwater actor is the bobbing exercise. After inhaling through the mouth at the surface, you breathe out through the nose as you go down. In other words, you bubble, bubble. The water's calm enough, but just look at the waves. If those lips could only speak, they'd say that underwater swimming is a fascinating thing. And here's another. Yes, just look her over.
Calm down, sir. All right. So, yeah, I mean, what we're seeing here is this like new pioneering technology that's going to come in handy for a number of different films. And also at the same time, Ocala National Forest is an area that is sought after by MGM producers for another very well-known novel written by Marjorie Kinnan Rollins. And she had her first meetings with studio executive Louis B. Mayer back in 1938. And when she signed her contract, she made it a stipulation that the film had to be made on location right outside of her Grange in Ocala National Forest. This is going to cause all kinds of logistical problems and issues. In fact, there are 3 attempts to make the film before it actually gets fully made. The second attempt was probably the most disastrous. Director Victor Fleming, the same director who did Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz in the same year. So this guy's no slouch and can definitely do a challenging production. Ends up literally abandoning the menagerie of animals that they had brought from the LA Zoo to help film The Yearling. And in fact, it won't be until late 1947 that the production actually begins to take off once again. And I want to let Claude Jarman, the character who played Jody, talk a little bit more about the troubled production and also some of the challenges that came with location filmmaking in Florida in the late 40s.
He had a unique opportunity. He would go into a city, for example, he came into Nashville, and he immediately went to the Board of Education, and he talked to the head of the Board of Education, told him who he was, what he was looking for, and said, I would like to go look in some rooms of the schools, of the fifth grade schools around the city. And if I see anyone I like, I'd like to be able to talk to them. And if I don't, no one will know that I was even here. And he came to my school on
producers can't do that
Valentine's
today.
Day, February 14, and he saw me standing up, taking down Valentine's, I guess, and immediately called me to the office, wanted to talk to me, and it eventually went on. Try to cut it a little short, where he came out to the house and said who he was and would I be interested in going to Hollywood for a test. And of course, my parents, so there were a lot of issues that we had to deal with. But that's exactly what happened. My father and I went to California for a test. And what's really interesting was there were 3 or 4 other kids there. But Clarence Brown told my father, said, we don't need to take a test. He's the kid. We're going to use him. And so that was how it all came about. And he was the director, and so he chose me. And it was a very, very difficult film to shoot. It took almost a year. From the time we started in April until the following December. So you're looking at a year and a half before it ever came out.
Well, you're a tall string bean of a guy anyway. Now, were you growing as fast as the fawn, as the deer was growing, the yearling?
Yeah. I was growing, and I probably grew 4 or 5 inches, during that period. But it was really a very difficult time because when we were on location in Florida for 4 months, we worked basically 7 days a week. There was no fun any part of it. It was a difficult film to make.
But your dad was with you or your mother the whole time?
No, just my father was with me. And then my mother and my sister came to California after we left Florida. We were on location from April to September in Florida, in Silver Springs, right near Ocala. And that's where we filmed it. It's funny because you mentioned that it made an impact on you. Someone else who always talked about it, and I used to hear it on TV, was Burt Reynolds, because he was from that part of the country. And he always talked about the yearling, which was kind of interesting. I never got to meet him, but he was always, referring to that as how it had an impact on him when he started to go into the movies.
Well, I know.
Yeah, when I worked at the museum in Jupiter, he actually had a couple artifacts from the movie, which was super cool to actually come across. But yeah, the pitfalls of production in Florida left sort of a sour taste in the mouth of a lot of Hollywood producers, whether it be corrupt producers who had harebrained schemes to build up studios that never materialized, or fraught productions. A local Orlando-based filmmaker named Arjan Hugh very famously had a meeting with Adolf Zukor to get advice on how to break into the industry in the 1940s. And Adolf Zukor, he was the head of Paramount Studios, and Zukor had some pretty cutting remarks about, filmmaking in Florida. We made pictures in Florida once. They don't want them. They don't know what they're doing, what they're talking about in Florida. We tried it. In Florida, they got has-beens and never makes it. They got convoys and operators. There are no producers in Florida. Don't get involved where you're not wanted. The business can kill you anyway. And Arjan Hugh did not listen to Zukor's advice. He'll set up shop in Orlando. He'll establish a couple studios, Empire Studios and Shamrock Studios in Winter Park. And he'll be there all the way up until his death in 1991, making some pretty interesting movies. In fact, he is responsible for cultivating a whole new genre of Western film called the Cracker Western. A film that he shot out in Wekiva Springs called Yellowneck was like one of the pioneering films of that type of genre. But also he was instrumental in bringing both Universal Studios and several other high-profile productions to Central Florida during this time period. Probably the most iconic of these so-called cracker westerns is Gary Cooper's The Distant Drums, directed by Raoul Walsh, and then sort of an answer to the film, kind of like how Hollywood does it today, where once they have one movie come out, studio has to come out with a similar kind of thing, called Seminole with Anthony Quinn and Rock Hudson. And these are films that are shot entirely on location. Newton Perry, the same underwater filmmaker who helped bring production to Silver Springs, is a location scout and also a stunt double for both Cooper and a number of the actors within the film. In fact, I'll play a short trailer for Distant Drums to give you a taste of, exactly what they were attempting to offer for this movie.
Across the Florida Territory, ablaze with the long and bitter Seminole War, the famous jungle fighter, Captain Quincy Wyatt, leads a battalion over the peninsula to the Gulf of Mexico to destroy a Spanish fortress and bring the conflict to an end. But with his mission accomplished and a beautiful hostage in
They got
his
permission
charge,
to
a
cause
new threat
explosions
faced
on the
Captain
Castillo
Wyatt.
San Marcos.
Ocalan, the great Seminole chief, had cut all avenues of escape but one.
Wait! Now you die!
And never did a man face a greater challenge. For the only retreat was to cross the wild, steaming, swamp-ridden Everglades. Ahead lay the unknown jungle, dark, weird, beautiful, deadly. Here was the constant menace of mutiny, the greater danger of a reckless woman, the ever-pursuing Seminoles, driving them deeper and deeper into this trackless green inferno. They became a lost battalion in a lost world.
We ain't running anymore. We're gonna stay right here and we're gonna fight.
All right, come on! Go right to it! Bringing dynamic force to this giant of all adventure stories is Gary Cooper as Captain Wyatt, Maury Alden, fiery new star, as the prisoner of war, who became a captive of love.
Ocala, come out of hiding and face me where I meet all crocodiles, in the water. Meet me with your own weapon, the knife.
Great stuff right there, right? And that's actually Newton Perry as Cooper's stunt double doing the underwater knife fight. Again, we had to have some very accomplished people do some of these scenes. My favorite story with Perry, because he ends up having about 20 different deaths in this movie, playing different American soldiers and Seminoles. It comes about halfway through the movie, and there's a sound effect that goes on to be known as the Wilhelm scream. There's a singer named Shelby Woolley who does the sound, but the first time that you actually hear the scream, well, you'll recognize it, because we've later seen this in Steven Spielberg and George Lucas films, so anytime that like a Nazi gets shot in Indiana Jones, or a stormtrooper gets shot in Star Wars, you hear this sound. And, well, Newton Perry is the victim of the first of these so-called Wilhelm screams. Great stuff. Better than Jaws. So, well, let's get to another iconic underwater film that uses a lot of underwater photography. And Newton Perry, once again, is connected to this. However, he got injured while shooting Distant Drums and basically gave up on his career as a stunt double after that film. So he turns to a protege of his who he had hired as a lifeguard, first at Silver Springs, and then later hired to be a performer at Weeki Wachee Springs, who did a number of incredible underwater feats and stunts, and was known to be able to hold his breath for anywhere between 3 to 4 minutes underwater continuously. And Rico Browning, at this point, was a college student at the University of Florida, and he encouraged Browning to meet with two producers he had been speaking with, Jack Arnold and William Allen, who had come up with an idea for a new monster that they wanted to introduce into the Universal pantheon of monsters, the Gill-Man. And Browning, well, he had no idea what he was getting into, but it will both change his life and really change the direction of Florida's film industry from this point forward.
It Came from Outer Space had been produced in 3D, a process then at the height of its popularity. Since no 3D film had yet been shot underwater, it was a foregone conclusion that the Black Lagoon would literally leap off the screen.
It's almost impossible to explain to a young viewer what it was like to see a 3D movie during the heyday of 3D films. And envision, if you will, that you're sitting in an audience and suspended before you is a three-dimensional cube of water. Remarkable how vivid that was.
Two interlocked cameras photographed each scene from slightly different perspectives. The lightweight underwater version of the 3D rig was specially designed by cameraman Scotty Welburn. In theaters, precisely synchronized projectors overlapped the images, which were fused into 3 dimensions by the use of polarizing filters.
This was a projection filter that would have been used for one of the 2 projectors. The light would pass through this filter, be polarized, and then reflect from the silver screen. And then the audience would be wearing these type of Polaroid glasses. So each eye would only see the image coming off either the left or right projector. And that's what was utilized to achieve the 3D effect.
Since the screenplay insisted on an object for the creature's affection, it was only appropriate that Universal ingenue Julia Adams, later known as Julie, was one of the first performers to be cast.
Well, in those days, the studio simply assigned us movies to do. And when I was assigned this picture, I thought, oh no, I'm not going to do a horror picture, whatever. So, but I was a pretty good little girl, so I usually did what they said. And then once I got into it, I had a lovely time.
Actor Richard Carlson, the star of It Came from Outer Space, became a fixture of science fiction films through his portrayals of scientist heroes. Quite a change for Hollywood, where most scientists were mad, or at least bent on world domination.
He had a wonderful kind of sophistication about him that I thought worked very well in these pictures, because when you put Richard Carlson there and he believes in what's going on, it gives it a great ring of truth, because you think, wow, it must be true.
But what would the creature look like? And more important, who would play him? The first actor considered for the role was Glenn Strange, a former stuntman who had played the Frankenstein monster in 3 Universal films. But Strange didn't consider himself much of a swimmer and turned the part down. Rico Browning was a college student at the time Universal began scouting underwater locations in Florida.
And someone suggested to Universal, or to the producer, William Allen, I believe his name was, that Wakulla Springs would be a very good location for the creature to be filmed. It was a very eerie looking place, mainly because Ed Ball, who owned it, had protected it over the years, and it was just totally undeveloped as far as civilization is concerned. So Jack Arnold and Scotty Welburn, who was the cameraman, I picked them up at the airport, took them to the Springs, and showed them around, and they liked what they saw. And Scotty got his underwater camera out, and he asked me if I would swim in front of the camera so they could get some perspective as to the size of logs and people and fish and whatever in the grass. And I said, sure, so I did. I'd say it's a couple of weeks later, maybe 3 weeks, I got a call from Jack Arnold, and he said, we like the way you swim. He said, how would you like to be the creature of the Black Lagoon? I said, well, I don't know what it is, but fine.
We shot everything of the first unit on the back lot at Universal. And the underwater scenes were shot in Florida, and for the clarity of the water and so on. So we were really shooting those 2 parts at the same time. But the illusion somehow is that we are truly in a very mysterious and faraway place.
2 units, of course, required 2 creatures.
Named Ginger Staley was Julia Adams's stand-in for those scenes. So Browning and Staley are shooting all those underwater ballet sequences in Florida while they're simultaneously filming all the land scenes in California. And my favorite story, I had a chance to both interview Ginger Staley and Rico Browning before they both sadly passed. And my favorite story with Browning was that it was impossible for him to see out of the Gillman costume, and he would have to come up for air eventually. One time he swum off course when he had to relieve himself, and there was a family having a picnic. And mind you, the movie hadn't come out yet, and it's Florida. We have a lot of weird stuff. So he got a good laugh out of their reaction right there. In fact, again, I keep staying on underwater photography, but another person who became very fixated with this was Howard Hughes, who was getting stranger and stranger by the 1950s. And one of his visions is that one day people will be going to the movies underwater. And, well, we're in Florida, so maybe one day we will be having to go to the movies underwater. And he built the world's first operating underwater film theater. And the film that premiered called Underwater, and its premiere was at Silver Springs, starring Jane Russell. Another sort of unforeseen consequence of The Creature from the Black Lagoon, Earl Jernigan, who was one of the costume designers who helped make the Gillman costume a little bit more mobile and a little bit more breathable for Rico Browning, actually was given one of the costumes by Browning as sort of a thank you. And Jernigan was very closely tied into all the different goings-ons on films that were shot in Ocala. And in 1961, Elvis comes to Ocala to film the only one of his Florida films that were actually shot in Florida. All his other ones, like Clambake, it's kind of bizarre because you'll see him on like water skis and then there's mountains in the background, or you'll see like an oil rig, or, it's supposed to be in Miami and there's like a sunset over the water. So this film is the only one. It's shot like mostly around Inverness and in Ocala. And Jernigan was so excited to go see Elvis that he also brought his nephew, Tom Petty. And Petty actually watched a couple of the scenes filmed for Follow That Dream, and he recalled in his autobiography that this was really the moment that he decided he wanted to become a rock star. So we can even credit Tom Petty's incredible music career to the movie industry right here in Florida. Rico Browning isn't done yet either. Browning, after his work in the Creature from the Black Lagoon series, moves down to Miami, and he joins up with a producer named Ivan Tors, who is coming off of a hit TV series starring Lloyd Bridges called Sea Hunt. And Tors, who of course filmed all kinds of underwater scenes too, turns to Browning and relies on Browning as a stunt double for all kinds of scenes. And after Sea Hunt wraps, Browning begins toying with the idea of becoming a writer. And he pitches an idea for a novel that he wanted to write about a boy and a dolphin. I think you see where I'm going with this. And I think I have the clip here, or I don't. Okay. So I'll just sum it up then. Browning basically appears to Ivan Tors and he asks him, I need some help getting some traction with publishers. So he sends him the treatment, and Tors reads it. He says, forget about the novel, let's make a movie. And thus Flipper is born. So the movie's made, the NBC series takes off, and it's so successful that we end up seeing a television boom come to South Florida during this time period. Ivan Tors relocates his film studio from Nassau in the Bahamas to Miami, and he makes all kinds of animal-themed feature films and TV shows all throughout this time. In the late 1960s, Jackie Gleason, who's coming fresh off of The Honeymooners and his own success with the Jackie Gleason Show, manages to convince CBS to build its own TV studio right near the NBC studios for Ivan Tors. And I have this interview with Jackie Gleason that can kind of sum up a little bit about what it took to actually bring him and his menagerie of musicians down to Miami.
Blue, Jackie Gleason decided he didn't want to do a show in New York. He wanted to do it in Miami.
When we're doing The Honeymooners, I had a a big contract for that for 2 years. And after the first year, I said I didn't want to do it, and they didn't believe me. They thought I had a job somewhere else. And finally, they realized that I just didn't want to do it. And when they approached me to do another show, I was in California making a picture, and I said, all right. I said, but I want a train that goes to Florida, because I'd come down here and played golf and liked it, and I figured, might as well go to Florida and do the show, play golf all the time. And they went for it.
What was on that train?
Everything. We had 2 Dixieland bands come from California. They would spell each other. I'd say don't take 5 miles. And parties went on 24. I found out that I couldn't attend the parties.
Were there girls on that train?
Were there girls? There certainly were. And they were very, very nice girls. Nothing untoward happened. It might have been because the berths were too small, but regardless of that, nothing happened on that trip.
I do wonder how he knew that, though. So this is really a new era in the film and television industry in Florida. CBS is building a studio. NBC has these stories that are being shot. ABC sets up at Weeki Springs. And throughout this time, too, Ivan Tors has a vision for his studio to not just be a self-contained film production studio, but also a theme park. And a theme park where visitors could come and watch a live set and then do all kinds of different rides and attractions. So we're talking, 25 years before Universal Studios and the Ride the Movies? Ivan Tors was a visionary behind this concept. As Ivan Tors Studios is really at its heyday, he starts getting kind of eclipsed and pushed out by the wonderful world of Disney. And of course, Walt Disney and Orlando's Big Bang is soon looming. And with the end of Ivan Tors Studio in the late 60s and 70s, there's a bit of a decline in production in South Florida, but then things pick up again in the 80s with some unforeseen consequences. The 80s is a pretty tumultuous time in Miami and South Florida in general, but it also ends up presenting some unexpected opportunities for the film industry. When Harold Ramis was scouting locations to shoot Caddyshack, which is set like in the Midwest, they realized that most of the National Lampoon team could not do a film shoot without running on cocaine. And they were afraid if they smuggled their cocaine to like Wisconsin or Iowa, it'd be a little bit harder to get it past customs. But if they can go right to the source of where it's being brought into the U.S., maybe the production will go a little bit smoother. So Caddyshack ends up getting shot in Davie, Florida instead. When Brian De Palma looks to do a remake of Scarface, Shame of a Nation, they retool the narrative to feature a Cuban maldito named Tony Montana, weirdly played by Al Pacino. And there's a lot of frustration within the Miami community over Al Pacino's casting and, of course, the stereotypes within the film. Demetrio Perez, Miami commissioner at the time, called for Cuban Americans in Miami to obstruct the production at all costs. So if they needed access to electricity or a fire hose, somebody would very conveniently park their car in front of the production team. And it became so obstructive that after 2 weeks of shooting in Miami, De Palma throws up his arms and films the rest of the movie in Los Angeles. The problem is that, the movie's still set in Miami. For the most part, still looks like Miami. And Miami gets all the bad press and bad reputation, but none of the local spending. So a year later, when director Michael Mann and producer Anton Yurkovich are pitching to NBC, and NBC had only been pretty good to South Florida and to the Miami area, an idea for a TV show about cops in Miami. Well, this time the city commission's office was a little bit more receptive, and this is where Miami Vice is born.
That then NBC chief Brandon Tartikoff scribbled MTV Cops on a piece of paper, and from there a series was born, and the way they were telling stories through music. An article about the large amount of undeclared income in Dade County, Florida, its underworld of under-the-table money, had all the right elements of style, seediness, and sizzle for a great cop show.
The action is where the money is. So you follow the money. And it's cause and effect of all that cash.
So where else can a big city player find a good time in a town like this?
Everywhere. If Miami doesn't have it, nobody's thought of it yet.
Yurkovich wanted his cops to work undercover, but he needed a way for them to blend in with the high-living lowlifes they were investigating. He got inspiration from a federal law that allows the government to seize any property used in a crime, even, say, a Ferrari sports car.
And allowed me as a writer to create a couple characters who are cops, you know, making a measly 35 G's a year, and give them access to...
I'm gonna be wearing an Armani blazer. You're gonna be wearing a wire.
Yurkovich pitched his idea to NBC. The city of Miami, however, took a little longer to convince. The early 80s had been a turbulent time in Miami. Race riots, the nation's highest murder rate, and rampant drug smuggling had all tarnished the city's once glowing image as a tropical paradise. City officials wanted to brighten its reputation and worried that a show called Miami Vice would bring the wrong kind of attention.
They were horrified at the title.
Yurkovich had to...
Well, that's an understatement right there. But the gamble pays off. This idea of rebranding Miami as America's Casablanca ends up leading to a boom in tourism in South Florida. The Art Deco district in Miami Beach was nearly slated for demolition in the early 1980s, and it is the surge in tourism spending in Miami that helps to lead to all kinds of revitalizations to the architecture of Miami, of Miami Beach. And in fact, there's a phenomenon that has now been called the Miami Vice effect that credits the impact that local spending on productions and tourism can have on a community. So that said, other communities don't fare so well when they try to go all in with the movies. And one of my favorite stories to come across was how Mount Dora went all in on the making of Honky Tonk Freeway, which in 1981, next to, I believe, Empire Strikes Back, or no, Indiana Jones, Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, was the most expensive film made of 1981. And, well, the spending kind of goes in the wrong direction, let's just say.
So Highway 441 stayed on the outskirts of Mount Dora. But in 1981, another highway came right through downtown. This time, it was the Honky Tonk Freeway. Hollywood came calling and transformed Mount Dora into the fictional community of Ticklaw.
This movie, Honky Tonk Freeway, comes to town. William Devane's going to be the star. Jessica Tandy's in it. I think Hume Cronin is in it. Howard Hessman is in it. All these big B and A level Hollywood stars are coming to town. City Council signs off on it. You know, if we've got this director and these actors and this $25 million budget, which at the time was a lot, they're going to come to Mount Dora and we're going to give them carte blanche. We're going to make things happen for them. A subplot in the movie required Mount Dora being painted pink. Hey, sounds good to us. These folks are from Hollywood. They let them paint the town pink. Another subplot of the movie is an elephant called Bubbles is going to water ski on Lake Dora. So they do it, and they have this movie patched together, and the movie comes out, and it's a complete bomb. They didn't have a theater in Mount Dora to show it, so they got the Tropic Twin Theater up in Leesburg. The movie premiere is going to be there. Honky Tonk Freeway, Hollywood celebrities, Governor Graham, senators, there's congressmen, and they sit down to watch this movie, and it's like, this is going to be great. Everybody hated it. It's one of the funniest slash saddest, stories in Mount Dora history.
So Highway
sums up Florida film history in a nutshell too, right? A lot of funny, but also a bit of sad mixed in. Let's stay on funny for a minute longer. My favorite film out of any of the ones I've researched was one that I did not even realize was made in my own backyard as a UCF film professor. In 1987, a local Taekwondo dojo owner named YK Kim had a goal to make a movie that he thought would bring about world peace. We don't have world peace, do we? And at least at the time, only 6 theaters actually showed this film. It would not be until its wonderful rediscovery in the 2010s that it's become the cult classic masterpiece that it is. So The Miami Connection is a movie about a group of UCF students who by day are Taekwondo students and UCF students, by night are rock and roll stars, and they have to team up together to stop a gang of drug-dealing ninjas, you heard me right, that are going to turn Orlando into what Miami has already become, a den of vice and sin. And it has the most banging 1980s soundtrack I can find in any movie from this period.
The one, the only, Dragon Sound!
Supposedly cost about $2 million to make. I think some of that money went into cocaine. I'm not sure. But I do love showing it to my UCF students because I don't do any preparation for them at all. So they're ready to see like a very serious film from the 1980s. And then they're like, what is this? So, this actually signals a new era in Central Florida film history with a major boom that comes in the late 80s and early 90s of a lot of mid-budget motion pictures. One of the big standard bearers of this was Governor Graham, who in the 80s took regular meetings with film producers in Los Angeles, and he becomes one of the key driving forces behind the creation of Disney MGM Studios, convincing Universal to set up its back lot, starting with Parenthood in 1989. And really, for this brief moment, we are seeing Orlando starting to become another hub for production. And Orlando, I feel, ends up suffering many of the same degree of bad luck that Jacksonville had in the 1910s. But that said, I just want to show you just like how all in the Orlando community was. My favorite story I came across was from the filming of Lethal Weapon 3, where Orlando Mayor Bill Frederick and Bob Tetragrossa coordinated with Richard Donner, the director, and they agreed to let the production film the demolition of Orlando City Hall for about $50,000, which normally these kind of demolitions cost millions to have filmed. So bottom dollar prices. They go all in, and Bill Frederick was so into it, kind of like the way Mayor Bowden in Jacksonville was into it. And I'll let him actually talk about his experience in the filming of.
We had decided to build a new city hall, and we actually completed the building, and it was surrounding the old city hall. And we had to take that down, and the way they decided was to blow it up. So we ended up selling it to the people that were filming Lethal Weapon. And we had Mel Gibson and Danny Glover and a ton of people that surround those kind of activities. But they were just really nice people, very friendly, very accommodating. And the night that we actually blew up the building, Danny and Mel did the stunt. They came running out the front steps just as the gas and all of that stuff. That wasn't actually the building going down, but the simulation of it. They made it look like that. They came running out the front, jumped over a car that was parked. We came down in a truck. There were several of us. I was dressed up as captain of the bomb squad, who had been called. And I had my one speaking word in a movie, and that was bravo. We already had built the new city hall, which was very close to the old building. And I've seen things blown up before, and sometimes it doesn't work quite like you want. it had to come straight down and collapse, which it did. But had it gone over and damaged the new building, I think I would have been the goat of that. So I was relieved. It was a fun episode. You don't get many of those, but it was one that we look back with fond remembrance.
I'm Buddy Pittman, and that's Central Florida.
And then just doesn't elaborate, right? And I actually interviewed one of the cameramen who were on location when they were filming, and they thought it would be a fun idea to play a prank on the director. After the building blew up and the demolition was done, they go to the director and go, "Did you get that?" Well, they did. And St. Petersburg also wanted to get in on it, so they volunteered to blow up a hotel that ends up getting into the tagline at the end of the film. And the production really didn't take that part too seriously. In their special thanks, all they say is the city of St. Petersburg, but they spell St. Petersburg B-E-R-G instead. It was just sort of like a throw-in right there. And that, in many ways, is a symptom of one of the shortcomings of this so-called Hollywood East movement of the late 80s and early 90s. The late, great Billy Maines of the Orlando Weekly did a post-mortem of the industry in 2008. And his estimation was essentially that, well, first of all, as we saw with Lethal Weapon, what we have is a production, big budget production that comes to Orlando, it shoots what it needs to shoot, and then goes right back to Los Angeles right after. So you're not getting long-term local spending. And additionally to that then too, we're at a time where the industry itself is drastically changing. Hollywood is not what Hollywood was in the 30s, 40s, 50s any longer. It's not the center of gravity for either the American film industry or the global film industry. It's far more decentralized. And one of the great tragedies too was that the timing of Orlando's ascendancy also was about the time that the Canadian dollar collapses. And cities like Toronto and Vancouver start becoming big-time secondary locations as well. So it becomes very difficult to compete with Canada, eventually even Eastern Europe, and other regions of the globe that are willing to accommodate productions. Of course, Georgia, in more recent years, has been on the rise, and with Pinewood Studios becoming the monolith that it is right now, it's become a big challenge for filmmakers here in Florida to stay locally motivated. And of course, well, we've reached a lot more challenges in the 2010s. Now, throughout much of the 2000s and 2010s, we do see a number of really important and incredible TV shows and movies that are being made right here in Florida that use that unique landscape and environment in ways that only Florida can offer. You know, going right back to that clip that we saw of the distant drums, that tagline, right, about what the Florida environment can offer and what its landscape can offer, you can't replicate that in California. I think the most telling example I have right now is Dexter. So if you look at like the original Dexter series filmed in Miami, it feels like Miami, and you really immerse yourself in Miami. There's a new one called Dexter First Blood, New Blood, something Blood, and it's set in Miami, but it's very obviously filmed in Los Angeles, and you just don't feel that same kind of sense of place and connection to it. And that's become sort of one of our big challenges. At the same time, too, we have some very incredibly ambitious independent films that have really redefined genres and also have shown what Florida can offer. Barry Jenkins' Moonlight, I think, is one of the great examples. At $5 million, it is the lowest cost budget Best Picture winner in the history of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Sean Baker's Florida Project, I think, will go down as one of the great masterpieces of the 21st century. And it uses place and space at very minimal cost in some very ambitious and creative ways. But starting around the mid-2010s, this is where the legislator takes sort of a backward turn once again. In a very similar way to we saw that political turn in the 1910s, well, the 2010s is a rough year politically for the film industry, and a series of tax incentives that started with the Jeb Bush administration in the 1990s dry up by about 2012, 2013. By the time we get to 2015, 2016, they're gone. And shows like Bloodline, which were incredibly popular, and one of those early premiere shows that got Netflix original programming up and running, originally was set for a 5-season run. It ends after 3 seasons. There was a show called Ballers starring The Rock. They end up relocating to Los Angeles, and it becomes so symptomatic that Film Florida, an organization I've worked closely with, has estimated that about $2 billion in lost spending over the last roughly 10 to 15 years has been a result of these productions that are about Florida and set in Florida being moved elsewhere. Additionally to that then too, it's become almost a punchline, where if it's set in Florida, it might be filmed somewhere else. Most recently, there's a movie called Nickel Boys that just came out, adaptation of a Colson Whitehead novel set in a Florida school in the 1960s, filmed in Louisiana. I went and Apple TV is just showing Fly Me to the Moon. There are scenes that are shot outside Cape Canaveral, and it's mostly set in Cape Canaveral. But when you watch the movie, it's just something doesn't feel right if you've been to Merritt Island and if you've been to Cape Canaveral. And lo and behold, filmed in Georgia. When Ben Affleck was scouting locations to film his 1930s film noir, Live by Night, he wanted to film on location in Ybor City. It eventually turned out to be cheaper for him to rebuild Ybor City in Georgia than it was to actually film in the real place. And this has become, I think, a repeated challenge that we've seen within at least the mainstream production industry. More recently, at least, we've seen some examples of productions that really suspend the cost and realize the importance of place and location. Apple TV's Bad Monkey, I think, was a great example of using Key West, using Miami, and using Florida in a very real way. And at least like from what I've seen in more recent news conversations, showrunner Bill Lawrence, who's coming fresh off of Ted Lasso, and he has like the keys to the kingdom right now with Apple TV, could say, hey, I want to film here, and I want that authentic location, and was able to make that push. Now, I had just heard that the second season is going to be in Los Angeles instead, so I kind of lost my point on this argument right here. But just to show you how invested Floridians have always been to the industry, and I think just to show you how deep the commitment goes, the story that I opened my book with and my lead-in to get us thinking about just how invested Floridians have been in the movies comes right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Ocala Drive-In, again, just a couple miles from Silver Springs, where all those incredible pioneering films were being made in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Actually, in April and May of 2020, was the only place where first-run box office receipts were being recorded. The owner of the Ocala Drive-In, John Watzke, made a deal with IFC to premiere 2 films, The Other Lamb and Swallow. You don't have to run out and go see them. But needless to say, people looking for an escape during the pandemic went to the drive-in and were able to see first-run movies at a time where movie theaters across the country had all but shut down. And the Watzkes, they had a connection to the film industry that goes all the way back to the turn of the century. In fact, their grandfather had worked a projectionist union in New Orleans during the Spanish influenza pandemic in 1918. He helped to make sure that movie theater owners and projectionists had food on their table when theaters shut down over 100 years ago. And Watzke's remarks here, I think, kind of sum it up right here. Kind of like the last dinosaur standing, you know? Never in the day did I think that I would be at the top of the box office, but I ended up being the only one at the box office. So it's not hard to be the top if you're the only one. Coming from a family that's worked in theaters for over 100 years, the old cliche is the show must go on. It's not a cliche, it's a way of life. So the show must go on. And I feel like the show in Florida will eventually go on. We might be in a bit of an ebb right now, but if you study history, you know that there's always a turn. And that's really what my hope this book will start a conversation on, how rich the history of Florida's film industry is and ways that we can build it forward. So thank you all for being such a great audience. And I'm going to have a glass of wine and hang back and sign books if anybody would like to come chat. So thank you.